My guards froze the moment I sat down. I felt their fear before I heard it. A sharp intake of breath behind me, boots shifting on the metal floor, hands moving toward weapons they were forbidden to use inside the summit hall. I had just done the one thing every tutor, every guard, and my own mother had warned me never to do. I had sat beside a human. The station around us hummed quietly, filtered air moving through vents, distant voices from 100 different worlds mixing into a low static of nervous diplomacy. I was not supposed to be here, not alone, not without my escort standing between me and every stranger in the room. But I had slipped away during the reception, tired of polite nothings and rehearsed smiles, and I had walked to the long viewport at the edge of the hall where the stars looked closer than anywhere else on the station. He was already sitting there, a human, alone, still, staring out at the same stars I wanted to see. My whole life I had been told what his kind looked like in the stories: tall shadows with unblinking eyes, soldiers who did not know how to stop, a species so feared that entire fleets had once turned around rather than face them. I had expected to feel my skin crawl the moment I got close. Instead, I felt nothing but curiosity, sharp and reckless, pulling me forward like a current. So I sat down beside him. He turned his head slightly, just enough to notice me, and I braced myself the way I had been trained to, spine straight, eyes lowered just enough to avoid direct challenge, breathing controlled. I waited for the violence the stories always promised. I waited for the danger my mother swore lived just beneath every human's calm surface. Instead, he lifted the cup in his hand toward me. "Careful," he said. "It's terrible coffee, but it's hot." I did not understand half of the words, but I understood the tone. It was not a threat. It was almost kind. Behind me, one of my guards made a small strangled sound, like he had swallowed his own alarm. I heard the soft click of a comm device being activated, someone reporting my location, someone about to summon half the delegation to pull me away from this supposed danger. I ignored it. For the first time in my life, I ignored the warning bells entirely, and I stayed exactly where I was. The human beside me did not stand. He did not raise his hands, did not straighten into some threatening posture, did not do any of the things my instructors swore his kind always did in the presence of royalty from another system. He simply sipped from his cup again, watching the stars, as if a princess of the Drenari Empire sitting beside him was the least interesting thing that had happened to him all day. "You're not supposed to be here," he said finally, glancing sideways at me. "Not alone, anyway." "Neither are you," I answered before I could stop myself. I was told humans always travel in groups, units, squads, never alone. He almost smiled at that. It was a strange expression, softer than I expected, nothing like the cold, calculating look my tutors described. "Guess somebody forgot to tell me the rules," he said. I studied him carefully, the way I had been trained to study any potential threat, cataloging details my instructors said mattered. His posture was relaxed, but not careless. His hands were steady around the cup, no tremor, no tension in his shoulders, nothing like the barely restrained aggression I had been warned to expect. His eyes, when they met mine, held none of the emptiness the old records described. They looked tired, they looked human, whatever that truly meant, in a way no briefing had ever prepared me for. "You're staring," he said, not unkindly. "I was told your species does not blink," I said, because it was the first thing that came to mind, and immediately regretted it. He actually laughed then, a short, surprised sound that seemed to catch him off guard, as much as it did me. "Somebody's been feeding you some wild stories," he said. "We blink plenty. We also sleep. We complain about bad coffee. And right now, I'd very much like to know why a princess is out here talking to me, instead of surrounded by about a dozen very nervous-looking guards." "They're right behind me," I admitted. "I can hear at least 3 of them trying to decide whether interrupting us would be more dangerous than leaving me here." "Smart of them to hesitate," he said, though there was no menace in it, only a strange, dry humor. "Most people don't think that carefully before deciding humans are the scary ones in the room." Before I could answer, I heard my name spoken sharply from somewhere behind me, my formal title layered over it like armor, an order disguised as a request. I turned to see my personal guard captain, Sorel, standing rigid several paces away, her hand hovering near the small defensive device clipped to her belt, her eyes locked on the human beside me as though he might lunge at any moment. "Your Highness," she said carefully, each word measured, "you are asked to return to the delegation immediately." I did not move. Some old, buried part of me, the part that had spent years listening to warnings about this exact species, urged me to obey without question. But a newer part of me, awake for the first time in a long while, wanted to understand why every warning I had ever received felt so wrong sitting this close to him. "I'll return shortly," I said, keeping my voice steady, layering just enough royal authority into it to hold my ground. "I am simply speaking with a delegate. He is human," Cyril said, as if that explained everything, as if the word itself was a complete argument. "I noticed," I said dryly, and beside me, the human made a small sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. Cyril's jaw tightened, but she did not approach further, held back by protocol that forbade guards from physically restraining a member of the royal line without direct provocation, and by the deeper, older fear that made her hesitate before doing anything that might be interpreted as aggression toward a human delegate in a room full of cameras and observers from a dozen worlds. "You should probably go with her," the human said quietly, once Cyril had stepped back to relay the situation to someone higher up the chain, "before this turns into an incident nobody wants." "Are you afraid of an incident?" I asked, genuinely curious. Every story I had ever heard implied his kind welcomed conflict, thrived on it, searched for reasons to prove their strength. He shook his head slowly. "I'm afraid of you getting in trouble for something that isn't worth the trouble," he said. "That's different." I did not have an answer for that. It was such a simple, almost gentle concern, nothing like the calculated manipulation my advisors always warned humans were capable of. I found myself wondering, not for the first time since sitting down, how many of the stories I had grown up believing were built on truth, and how many were built on fear that had calcified into fact simply because no one had bothered to question it. "What's your name?" I asked, because somehow, in all of this, no one had said it yet. "Ethan," he said. "Ethan Marsh. Sergeant, technically, though I don't think that title means much to you." "Valera," I offered in return, "though I imagine you already knew that." "I did," he admitted. "Word travels fast when a princess disappears from a room full of very important people." Somewhere behind us, more footsteps approached, heavier this time, and I recognized the particular rhythm of my mother's personal escort, the Empress's own guards moving with practiced urgency through the crowded hall. My time was running out, and some reckless, curious part of me hated that fact more than I expected. "I have questions," I said quickly, before the moment could be taken from me. "About your people. About the war everyone still whispers about, like it happened yesterday." Ethan's expression shifted slightly, something more guarded settling over his features, though not unkind. "That's a long conversation," he said. "Longer than we've got right now, I think." "Then we'll continue it later," I said, with more confidence than I actually felt, because in that moment, surrounded by warnings I had ignored and guards closing in from every direction, I had already decided that this was not going to be the only conversation we would ever have. He looked at me for a long moment, something unreadable in his expression, and then he nodded once, slow and certain. "All right, Your Highness," he said. "Later, then." My mother's guards reached us a moment after that, their presence formal and immediate, and I rose from my seat before they could insist, smoothing my robes with practiced calm even as my mind raced with everything I had just witnessed. No violence, no threat, no cold, calculating cruelty. Just a tired man drinking bad coffee, watching stars, and worrying more about my safety than his own advantage. As I was escorted back toward the delegation, I glanced over my shoulder once, and found Ethan still sitting where I had left him, watching me go with an expression I could not quite name. Not triumph, not satisfaction, Something closer to concern, the same quiet worry he had shown when warning me to return before trouble found me. I did not know it yet, standing there in that crowded hall with my heart still racing from the encounter, but everything I believed about humanity, every warning drilled into me since childhood, every fear my mother had built her entire diplomatic strategy around, had just begun to crack. And I had chosen, against every rule I had ever been taught, to keep pulling at that crack until I understood exactly what lay beneath it. The reprimand came before I had even reached my private quarters. Sarah walked half a step behind me the entire way, silent, her disapproval radiating off her like heat from a dying star. I knew what waited for me before the doors even opened. My mother stood in the center of the room, arms folded, her formal robes still perfectly arranged despite the late hour, and I understood immediately that she had heard everything already. "Do you have any idea," she said, before I had even crossed the threshold, "what you just did?" I sat down, I said. I talked. Nothing happened. "Nothing happened," she repeated, her voice sharp enough to cut. "Valera, you sat beside a human, alone, unguarded, in full view of 6 other delegations who are still deciding whether to trust our judgment on this alliance. Do you understand what that looks like? A princess of the Drenari Empire, defying every protocol, sitting beside the one species this entire summit exists to negotiate boundaries around." "He offered me a drink," I said, knowing even as the words left my mouth how foolish they sounded against the weight of her fury. "He was gentle. He was worried about my safety more than his own position." My mother's expression did not soften. If anything, it hardened further, the way old wounds sometimes do when pressed. "That is exactly how they work," she said. "That is exactly what the old records describe. Calm, patient, kind, until the moment kindness no longer serves them." I wanted to argue, but something in her voice stopped me, an old grief buried just beneath the anger, something that told me this was not simply about protocol or reputation. This was personal in a way I had never fully understood before. "You were not there," she continued, quieter now, turning slightly away from me to look out at the stars through the tall window of her chamber. "During the Silence War, you did not see what they were capable of when provoked. I did." I had heard fragments of this story my entire life, pieces handed down through tutors and old historical recordings, but never from her directly, never with this rawness in her voice. I stayed silent, sensing that pushing further would close the door she had just barely opened. "They did not start that war," she said. "But when it came to them, they refused to stop until every threat against their people was gone. Not defeated, gone. Entire fleets, entire forces that had once seemed unstoppable simply ceased to exist by the time humanity finished responding. They did not need to conquer worlds to prove a point. They only needed to demonstrate, once, exactly how far they were willing to go, and after that, no one tested them again." "That doesn't mean the man I spoke to today is dangerous," I said carefully. "That was decades ago. He wasn't even a soldier in that war. He's tired. He drinks bad coffee. He worried about me more than himself." "That is precisely how dangerous things survive," my mother said, turning back to face me fully now, "by seeming harmless right up until the moment they are not." I did not have a response for that, not one that would satisfy her, not one that would erase decades of fear built on genuine, painful history. But something in me, some stubborn certainty I could not fully explain, refused to accept that Ethan Marsh, sitting quietly by a viewport with tired eyes and an offered cup of terrible coffee, was the same thing as the merciless force my mother described. "I am not asking you to trust them," I said finally. "I am only asking why we assume every single one of them carries the same capacity for what happened decades ago. Isn't that the same mistake other species made about us, once, before they understood who we actually were?" My mother studied me for a long moment, something complicated moving behind her eyes, somewhere between frustration and something almost like reluctant respect. "You have always asked difficult questions," she said finally. "It is one of the reasons I worry about you constantly." "Then let me ask one more," I said, emboldened by the fact that she had not yet forbidden me from continuing. Why are we here at all, if not to determine whether an alliance with humanity is actually possible? If we assume the worst before we even try to understand them, what is the point of this entire summit? She did not answer immediately. Instead, she walked slowly toward the window, watching the distant lights of other stations and ships gathered for the negotiations. Dozens of species circling the same uncertain question that had brought all of us here. The summit exists, she said eventually, because the alternative to understanding them is far worse than the risk of trying. But that does not mean I am willing to risk my own daughter to satisfy that understanding. I was never in danger, I said, not for a single moment. You do not know that, she said sharply, turning back to me. None of us know that. That is precisely the problem, Valera. We are trying to negotiate boundaries with a species capable of ending conflicts so thoroughly that entire star systems fell silent in the aftermath, and you decided the best use of your time was to sit beside one of them unguarded, based on nothing more than a feeling. It wasn't nothing, I said quietly. He didn't threaten me. He didn't try to manipulate me. He worried about consequences falling on me instead of caring about whatever advantage he might have gained from the encounter. If that is manipulation, then it is a very strange kind. My mother sighed, the sound heavier than I expected, carrying more exhaustion than anger now. You are young, she said. You see kindness and assume it means safety. I have seen enough to know the two are not always connected. Then let me learn the difference myself, I said, instead of only through old stories and secondhand fear. She did not answer that directly, though something in her expression shifted, some old argument settling into uneasy silence between us. Instead, she instructed Sorel to increase security around my quarters, forbade me from attending any further sessions without a full escort, and dismissed me for the evening with a tired wave of her hand that told me the conversation, for now, was over, even if the disagreement was not. I did not sleep well that night. I kept replaying the encounter by the viewport, searching for the danger my mother insisted must be hidden somewhere beneath Ethan's calm exterior, and finding nothing but a tired man who had been kind to a stranger for no clear benefit to himself. The stories I had grown up with painted humanity as something closer to an unstoppable force of nature, terrifying in its capacity for both restraint and devastation, but nothing in that brief conversation matched the coldness those stories described. The next morning, word spread quickly through the delegation about what had happened, filtered and distorted through a dozen different perspectives by the time it reached me secondhand. Some delegates seemed amused by the incident, treating it as harmless curiosity from a young princess. Others seemed genuinely alarmed, whispering about security breaches and diplomatic risk, casting suspicious glances toward the human delegation whenever they passed through the main hall. I caught fragments of conversation among advisors who did not realize I was close enough to hear, voices low but sharp with concern. One counselor, a sharp-featured representative from an allied system named Drask, seemed particularly insistent that the encounter had been staged, that the human delegate had deliberately positioned himself to draw attention from the royal line, perhaps even to gather information or influence through personal connection rather than formal negotiation. It is a well-documented tactic, Drask said to another advisor, his voice tight with suspicion. They understand relationships better than any species we have encountered. It would not surprise me if this entire encounter was designed from the beginning. I wanted to interrupt, to argue that nothing about the moment had felt designed, that Ethan's concern for my safety had seemed genuine rather than calculated, but I held my tongue, aware that speaking up would only draw more attention to an incident my mother was already struggling to manage. Still, the accusation lingered in my mind throughout the day, an uncomfortable seed of doubt planted amid my own certainty. Had I misread the entire encounter? Had months of careful diplomatic training left me naive enough to mistake calculated strategy for simple kindness? I turned the question over and over as the day's sessions dragged on, formal negotiations continuing around topics of trade routes and resource boundaries that barely held my attention. By evening, my curiosity had grown stronger than my caution, stronger even than my fear of further reprimand. I found myself standing outside my quarters, staring down the corridor that led toward the section of the station where the human delegation had been assigned temporary residence, weighing the risk of another encounter against the nagging need to understand whether what I had felt the day before was real or simply the beginning of exactly the kind of manipulation my mother and her advisors feared. I made my decision before I had fully finished considering the consequences, slipping past my assigned guards during the brief window between shift changes, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and defiance as I moved quietly through the station's corridors, determined to find Ethan Marsh again and settle, once and for all, whether the man I had spoken to by the viewport was exactly who he appeared to be, or something far more dangerous hiding behind a carefully constructed mask of quiet kindness. The corridor leading to the human quarters was quieter than I expected. Fewer patrols, fewer cameras, as if the other delegations preferred to keep their distance rather than monitor humanity too closely. I found Ethan exactly where a junior officer told me he would be, in a small observation lounge near the edge of the human section, sitting with a datapad in one hand and an expression of quiet exhaustion on his face. He looked up when I entered, surprise flickering across his features before settling into something more careful. "You're not supposed to be here," he said, echoing his own words from the day before, though this time there was genuine concern layered beneath them. "I know," I said, stepping further into the room despite the warning in his voice. "I needed to ask you something, and I did not think another formal meeting would let me ask it honestly." He set the datapad aside, giving me his full attention. "All right," he said. "Ask." "My mother believes you are dangerous," I said bluntly, deciding that directness would serve me better than careful diplomatic phrasing. "Not you specifically, perhaps, but your entire species. She told me about the Silence War, about fleets disappearing, about a devastation so complete that no one dared test humanity again after it ended. She believes your kindness yesterday was calculated, a tactic rather than genuine feeling." Ethan was quiet for a long moment, and I watched something shift behind his eyes, an old weight settling over his expression that had nothing to do with exhaustion. "She's not wrong about the war," he said finally. "Not about what happened, but she might be wrong about why." "Then tell me why," I said. "Tell me the truth, not the version filtered through decades of fear." He set his cup down and leaned back, choosing his words carefully. "Before the Silence War," he said, "there was another war, longer before your empire ever heard of us. A war we didn't choose, and one we very nearly lost completely." I had never heard this part of the story. My tutors had always begun humanity's history with the Silence War itself, as if nothing meaningful existed before it. "What happened?" I asked. "First contact went badly," Ethan said. "Worse than badly. A species we'd never encountered decided humanity was resource rather than neighbor, and they nearly wiped out most of our early colonies before Earth even understood what was happening. We lost entire cities, entire populations. It took years to recover, and longer to rebuild any kind of trust in the idea that the universe wasn't simply hostile by default." I sat down slowly across from him, absorbing the weight of what he was describing, so different from the story my mother had told, which painted humanity as the aggressor rather than the survivor. "After that," Ethan continued, "we made a decision as a species. Never again. Not out of pride, not out of some desire for conquest, but out of something closer to grief, turned into resolve. We built our defenses not to dominate anyone, but to make sure no one could ever do that to us again, without paying a cost too high to consider worth it." "And the Silence War," I said quietly. "That was the cost. That was someone testing whether we meant it," Ethan said. "They didn't believe a species that young could hold that kind of resolve. They found out we did, and once they did, humanity stopped fighting immediately, the moment the threat was gone. No occupation, no conquest of their territory, no lasting cruelty beyond what was necessary to end the immediate danger. We didn't want their worlds. We only wanted to prove, once, completely, that provoking us wasn't worth the cost, so no one would have to test that resolve again. I studied him carefully, searching for any sign of exaggeration, any hint of the manipulation Drask had warned about, and found none. His voice carried the weight of genuine history, not rehearsed propaganda. "That is not the story I was taught," I said slowly. "Most species outside our alliance only hear the ending," Ethan said. "The part where entire fleets went silent. They rarely hear the beginning, the part where we were the ones nearly erased first." Something inside me shifted, an old certainty cracking further, revealing a version of events far more complicated than the simple monster narrative I had grown up believing. "Why does no one correct the story?" I asked. "If the truth paints you as protective rather than aggressive, why let the fear stand uncorrected?" Ethan was quiet for a moment before answering. "Because fear keeps people cautious," he said. "And caution, as ugly as it feels sometimes, has kept another war from happening for decades. If people believe crossing us carries a cost too high to consider, they don't test it. The story protects more people than the truth would, even if it isn't fair to us." I sat with that for a long moment, the weight of it settling uncomfortably in my chest. "That seems like a heavy burden to carry," I said quietly, "letting an entire galaxy believe you are monsters, simply to keep the peace." "It is," Ethan admitted, something tired and old moving behind his eyes. "But it beats another silence war. It beats losing more people than we already have." I thought of my mother then, of the genuine grief buried beneath her fear, the way her voice had cracked slightly when she described the silence war the night before. Perhaps she believed the simpler story because the alternative, one where humanity's devastating resolve came from unimaginable loss, rather than cruelty, was somehow harder to reconcile with the safety she needed to feel for her empire and her daughter. "I want to tell her," I said, "what you just told me. I want her to understand there might be more to this than fear." Ethan's expression grew cautious again. "That's not really my story to spread around," he said. "And honestly, Your Highness, some of what I just told you isn't exactly common knowledge outside our own command structure. I probably shouldn't have said as much as I did." "Then why did you?" I asked. He considered the question for a long moment before answering. "Because you asked me directly, instead of assuming the worst," he said. "That matters more than you probably realize. Most people who come talk to us already have their minds made up. You didn't." Before I could respond, the door to the lounge slid open sharply, and I turned to find Cyril standing in the entrance, her expression somewhere between fury and relief, flanked by 2 additional guards I did not recognize. "Your Highness," she said, her voice tight with barely restrained emotion, "your mother has been informed of your absence. We must return immediately." I rose slowly, aware that this encounter had already gone further than the last, that consequences waiting for me back in the delegation hall would likely be more severe than a simple reprimand. Still, something in me felt lighter than it had in days, as if a weight I had not fully recognized had begun to lift. "Thank you," I said to Ethan, quietly, before turning to follow Cyril from the room, "for trusting me with that." "Try not to get in too much trouble because of it," he said, something almost like warmth in his tired voice. The walk back to the delegation hall felt longer than it should have, Cyril silent beside me, clearly processing how to explain another disappearance to the Empress without triggering a full diplomatic crisis. When we reached my mother's private chamber, she was waiting exactly as I expected, though this time her expression carried less fury and more genuine worry, the kind that came from fear rather than anger alone. "Twice," she said quietly, once the doors had closed behind us. "Twice now, Valera. Do you understand what this looks like to the other delegations? What it looks like to the humans themselves if their princess counterpart continues seeking them out unescorted?" "I learned something today," I said, deciding that honesty, even risky honesty, was the only path forward that made sense to me anymore. "Something I do not think you know, about the war, about why it happened, about what came before it." My mother's expression shifted, wariness replacing some of the worry. "What did he tell you?" I hesitated, remembering Ethan's own hesitation before sharing the story. the way he had called it something not entirely his to spread. But I also thought of my mother's genuine grief, buried beneath decades of careful diplomatic armor, and decided that perhaps she deserved to understand the fuller truth as much as I had needed to hear it myself. There was another war before the one we know about, I said carefully, one where humanity nearly disappeared entirely, at the hands of another species who saw them only as resource rather than people. The Silence War was not aggression, it was humanity, ensuring that kind of devastation could never happen to them again. My mother was silent for a long moment, something complicated moving across her features, memory and doubt and old grief, all tangled together. "That is not the account in any records I have access to," she said finally, though her voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. "Perhaps because most records only tell the ending," I said, echoing Ethan's own words, "not the beginning that led them there." She turned away from me, walking slowly toward the window again, staring out at the same distant stars that seemed to hold so many unanswered questions for both of us. "If this is true," she said quietly, almost to herself, "it changes a great deal about how this alliance should proceed. It does not erase what happened," I said carefully, "but perhaps it changes why it happened, and whether we should fear a repeat of it, or simply respect the boundary they have already proven they will protect." My mother did not answer immediately, and I understood that she needed time to reconcile decades of careful diplomatic strategy with this new, uncomfortable version of events. But something in her posture had shifted, the rigid certainty of before replaced with something more contemplative, more willing to consider possibilities she had not entertained until now. "Get some rest," she said finally, her voice gentler than it had been in days. "We will discuss this further tomorrow, once I have had time to consider what you have told me." I left her chamber that night with a strange mixture of relief and unease, aware that the fragile understanding I had built between myself and Ethan Marsh had just been tested in ways neither of us had fully anticipated, and uncertain whether the fuller truth I had shared would strengthen the fragile trust building at this summit, or unravel it entirely before it had a chance to take root. The following days passed with a strange, careful calm. My mother requested a private audience with the human delegation's senior representative, a composed woman named Colonel Grace Wilder, to quietly verify what I had shared. I was not present for that conversation, but I noticed the shift afterward, a subtle softening in how my mother's advisors spoke about the human delegation, less suspicion in their tone during formal sessions, more genuine curiosity replacing old assumptions. Ethan and I continued to meet, though more carefully now, in approved spaces during scheduled breaks, never entirely alone, but no longer forbidden either. Our conversations grew easier with each meeting, less about proving or disproving old fears, more about simply understanding each other as individuals rather than symbols of our respective species. He asked about my life growing up under the weight of royal expectation. I asked about his childhood, about a place called Earth that sounded both familiar and impossibly foreign, about family he missed more than he liked to admit. It was during one such conversation, 3 days after our meeting in the observation lounge, that everything changed. We were sitting in the same small lounge, the late hour meaning we were mostly alone, except for a single guard stationed politely near the door, when the station's lights flickered once, dimmed, and then plunged into a deep red emergency glow. Alarms began sounding through the corridors outside, distant at first, then closer, a rising wave of urgent noise that made my heart lurch immediately into my throat. Ethan was on his feet before I had even fully processed what was happening, his entire demeanor shifting in an instant from relaxed conversation to something sharper, more focused, more alert than I had seen him during any of our previous meetings. "Stay behind me," he said, his voice calm but carrying an authority I had not heard from him before. "What's happening?" I asked, rising as well, my pulse hammering. "Security breach," he said, already moving toward the door, checking the corridor beyond with quick, practiced glances. "Could be nothing. Could be something. Either way, we're not staying here to find out which." The guards stationed outside our door had already moved to intercept the growing commotion further down the corridor, leaving us momentarily alone as Ethan guided me quickly in the opposite direction, away from the source of the alarm, his hand light but firm on my shoulder, steering me around a corner before I could fully register what I was even running from. "Talk to me," I said, struggling to keep pace with him. "What kind of breach?" "Don't know yet," he said, glancing back the way we'd come. "Someone's trying to access restricted sections of the station. Commands locking down movement between delegations until they figure out who and why." We reached a junction in the corridor where several paths converged, and Ethan paused, listening carefully to the distant sounds of alarm and shifting security personnel, his expression calculating something I couldn't fully follow. "This way," he said finally, choosing a path that led away from the main delegation halls, toward a quieter service corridor I had never noticed before. "Shouldn't we be heading toward my guards?" I asked, even as I followed him without hesitation. "Your guards are probably heading toward the alarm," Ethan said. "Which means whoever caused this might expect that too. I'd rather get you somewhere safe first, than worry about reconnecting you with your own people." Something about his calm certainty steadied my own racing pulse, even as the alarms continued to echo through the station around us. We moved quickly but carefully, Ethan checking each junction before allowing us to proceed, his attention split between guiding me and monitoring something on a small device clipped to his wrist that I hadn't noticed before. "There," he said suddenly, pulling me gently but firmly into a recessed alcove, just as a group of unfamiliar figures moved through the intersection we had just left, moving with a purposeful quiet that felt entirely different from station security or diplomatic guards. I caught only a brief glimpse of them before Ethan's arm settled protectively in front of me, positioning himself between me and the passing group without ever fully blocking my view. "Who are they?" I whispered, once the group had passed. "Not sure," Ethan murmured back, his eyes still tracking the direction they'd gone. "But they're not station security, and they're not delegation guards either. That's a problem." My mind raced through possibilities, old warnings about sabotage attempts during previous diplomatic summits, rival factions who saw an alliance between the Drenari Empire and humanity as a direct threat to their own interests, and a cold, sinking realization that whatever was happening tonight might be directly connected to the very negotiations I had been so determined to understand from the inside. "We need to get you somewhere secure," Ethan said quietly, checking his wrist device again before glancing back at me. "There's a reinforced section near the human delegation's quarters, better shielded than most of the diplomatic halls. If this is what I think it might be, that's the safest place I can get you to right now." We moved again, more quickly this time, Ethan's guidance certain and unhesitating despite the growing chaos audible throughout the station. Twice more he pulled me aside as unfamiliar figures passed through nearby corridors, his instincts proving sharper than any warning system, his focus entirely on keeping distance between me and whatever danger moved through the station tonight. We were nearly to the human quarters when the corridor ahead of us suddenly illuminated with harsh emergency lighting, and three figures stepped directly into our path, their posture immediately hostile, weapons raised with clear intent rather than caution. I froze, every instinct screaming the danger my tutors had warned me about my entire life, though notably, for the first time, that danger was not coming from the human beside me. "Stay behind me," Ethan said again, his voice dropping into something colder, more controlled, every trace of the tired, gentle man I had come to know replaced by something sharper, more precise, a version of him I had never witnessed before and hoped never to see again after tonight. What happened next occurred faster than I could fully track, Ethan moving with a controlled efficiency that felt less like violence and more like inevitability, disarming and subduing the threat before me with a precision that left no room for escalation, no unnecessary harm beyond what was required to neutralize the immediate danger. Within moments, the three figures were restrained, their weapons secured, and Ethan was already speaking urgently into his wrist device, calling for station security to take custody of them, while simultaneously checking to ensure I remained unharmed. "Are you hurt?" he asked, turning to me immediately once the threat had been contained, his hands hovering carefully near my shoulders without quite touching, checking for any sign of injury with genuine concern rather than triumph over what had just occurred. "No," I managed, my voice shakier than I wanted it to be. "I'm fine. That was necessary," Ethan said simply, though something tired flickered behind his eyes, the same weariness I had noticed during our first conversation, now edged with something heavier. "I'm sorry you had to see that." I stared at the restrained figures being taken into custody by arriving security personnel, understanding slowly dawning as I recognized markings on their uniforms that identified them as agents of a rival delegation, one that had been vocally opposed to any alliance between our two peoples since the summit began. "They were trying to disrupt the negotiations," I said slowly, piecing together the fragments of what I had witnessed. "Or worse." "Looks that way," Ethan confirmed grimly. "Won't know the full extent until security finishes their investigation, but given the timing and the target, I don't think this was random." Colonel Wilder arrived moments later, flanked by additional security personnel and, to my relief, Sorrel and my mother's own guard, all converging on the scene with a mixture of alarm and urgent questions. I found myself quickly separated from Ethan, pulled aside by Sorrel, who checked me over with the same careful concern Ethan had shown moments before, while station security began the process of securing the scene and questioning the restrained intruders. "Your Highness," Sorrel said, once she was satisfied I remained unharmed, "your mother needs to see you immediately. This incident has triggered a full security lockdown across the summit." I glanced back toward where Ethan stood, speaking quietly with Colonel Wilder, his posture once again relaxed and tired, the sharp, controlled precision from moments before folded away as easily as it had emerged, as if that version of him existed only when genuinely necessary and never a moment longer than required. "He protected me," I said quietly to Sorrel, needing her to understand what had just happened before we moved any further from the scene. "Without hesitation, without any unnecessary harm toward those who threatened us." Sorrel's expression remained carefully neutral, though I noticed something shift behind her professional composure, a grudging acknowledgement she was not yet ready to voice aloud. "We will discuss this fully with the Empress," she said instead, guiding me firmly but gently back toward the main delegation halls. The walk back felt different than either of my previous returns, less like a princess being reprimanded for reckless behavior, and more like someone processing genuine danger successfully avoided through someone else's steady, controlled intervention. My mind kept replaying the moment those figures had blocked our path, the cold certainty in Ethan's voice, the precision and restraint he had shown even in a moment of genuine threat, nothing like the unchecked violence my entire upbringing had warned me humanity was capable of unleashing given the slightest provocation. By the time we reached my mother's chamber, word of the incident had already spread throughout the summit, and I found her waiting with an expression I had never seen on her before, somewhere between fear and something that looked almost like relief. "You're unharmed," she said immediately, crossing the room to check on me herself, despite Sorrel's earlier assurance. "I was told there was an attack, that intruders breached the security perimeter near the human quarters." "I was there," I said quietly. "Ethan protected me, without hesitation, and without causing any harm beyond what was necessary to stop them." My mother's expression shifted through several emotions in quick succession, relief giving way to something more complicated, an old certainty visibly wrestling with new evidence that contradicted decades of careful assumption. "Tell me everything," she said finally, guiding me to sit, her voice steadier now but still carrying the weight of genuine shock. From the beginning, I recounted the events as clearly as I could manage. The alarm, Ethan's immediate shift into careful, focused protection, the way he had guided me through the station, avoiding unnecessary risk at every turn, and finally, the controlled, precise manner in which he had neutralized the actual threat when it could no longer be avoided. By the time I finished, my mother sat in silence for a long moment, processing everything I had described against the fears she had carried for decades. "This changes things," she said finally, quietly, more to herself than to me. "This changes things considerably." I did not yet know how significantly, but something in her voice told me that whatever fragile progress we had made toward understanding humanity more fully was about to face its most important test yet, in the aftermath of tonight's attack, and in whatever decisions the summit would be forced to make about the future of this alliance moving forward. The investigation moved quickly once security had secured the intruders. By morning, the full details had spread through every delegation on the station, carried through official briefings and quiet corridor whispers alike. The 3 agents Ethan had subdued belonged to a faction within Counselor Drask's own delegation, individuals who had grown convinced that any alliance between the Drenari Empire and humanity represented an unacceptable threat to the balance of power they had spent generations carefully maintaining. Their plan, as security uncovered it, had been more ambitious than a simple disruption. They had intended to sabotage the summit's central communications array during the chaos, framing the human delegation for the attack in the process, hoping to destroy any possibility of alliance before it could take root, by making it appear as though humanity's presence at the summit had been a calculated act of aggression from the very beginning. Had Ethan not reacted as quickly and precisely as he did, the consequences might have unfolded very differently. Instead, his controlled intervention not only protected me directly, but also preserved crucial evidence that ultimately exposed the true architects of the attack, sparing the human delegation from exactly the kind of blame their enemies had hoped to manufacture. I was called before the full Summit Council 2 days later, an unusual request for someone my age and standing, but my mother insisted that my first-hand account carried weight the formal reports could not fully capture. I stood before representatives from every major delegation present at the summit, Counselor Drask notably absent, already facing consequences from his own government for the actions of his subordinates, and recounted exactly what I had witnessed that night. "He had every opportunity to cause far greater harm than was necessary," I said, addressing the assembled council directly, my voice steadier than I expected given the weight of the moment. "He restrained the threat with precision, ensured my safety without hesitation, and showed restraint even in a moment where restraint could have easily been abandoned. This is not the behavior of a species that thrives on unnecessary conflict. This is the behavior of someone who understands exactly how much force is required and refuses to use more than that." Murmurs moved through the assembled delegates, some skeptical, others visibly reconsidering positions they had held since the summit began. My mother stood beside me, her presence a quiet support I had not expected to need but deeply appreciated in that moment. "I have spent my entire reign believing humanity represented a danger we could only hope to manage rather than understand," my mother said, addressing the council in turn. "I believed this based on history I witnessed firsthand, history that was, I now understand, incomplete. What happened during the Silence War was not the beginning of humanity's story with violence. It was the end of a story that began with humanity nearly being erased entirely by another species who saw them only as resource to be claimed." The council chamber fell into a heavier silence at this, the weight of decades of assumption visibly shifting beneath the fuller truth my mother now shared openly, information she had quietly verified through her own private conversations with Colonel Wilder in the days following our initial conversation. "I do not say this to excuse what happened during that war," my mother continued. "The cost was real, and the fear it created was not unfounded, but fear built on an incomplete story serves no one, least of all those of us tasked with deciding whether alliance and understanding are possible, or whether we continue building walls based on stories that were never entirely true to begin with." Colonel Wilder, present for this session, rose to address the council directly, her composed demeanor carrying the same quiet authority I had come to recognize in Ethan during our conversations. "Humanity has never sought to be feared," she said. "We understand why that fear exists, and we have not always worked hard enough to correct it, in part because the fear itself provided a kind of protection we relied upon perhaps more than we should have. But an alliance built on fear alone is fragile, an alliance built on genuine understanding, even one that includes acknowledging real, difficult history, has a chance to last. The council session continued for hours after that, debate and discussion moving through details of the proposed alliance, with a new energy, less defensive, more genuinely collaborative than any session I had witnessed since the summit began. By the time it concluded, a framework for formal alliance between the Drenari Empire and humanity had been drafted, tentative but real, built on a foundation considerably more honest than the one that had existed only days before. That evening, as the summit's concluding ceremony approached, I found myself standing near the same viewport where everything had begun, watching the stars with a very different feeling than the reckless curiosity that had first drawn me there. Ethan found me there, as I somehow knew he would, settling beside me without hesitation this time, no guards rushing forward in alarm, no whispered warnings following his approach. "Quite a summit," he said, a hint of dry humor returning to his voice, the tension of recent days finally beginning to ease. "You saved my life," I said quietly, needing to say it directly rather than let it remain unspoken between us. Without hesitation, without unnecessary harm, exactly the way you described your people acting during the war, protecting only what needed protecting, and stopping the moment the danger was gone. "I meant every word of that," Ethan said. "It wasn't just a story I told you to make us look better. It's genuinely who we try to be, even when the galaxy assumes otherwise." "I believe you," I said, and found that I meant it completely, without any of the lingering doubt that had colored our earlier conversations. "I think my mother believes it now too, or at least believes it enough to build something real from here." "That's more than we usually get," Ethan said. "Most delegations either fear us completely or trust us blindly. Neither extreme is particularly useful. What you and your mother are doing, actually trying to understand the full picture before deciding, that's rare." The concluding ceremony began soon after, delegates from every participating species gathering in the main hall for the formal signing of preliminary alliance agreements. I stood beside my mother during the proceedings, watching as the framework we had all worked toward over these tense, transformative days finally took formal shape. Humanity's delegation, standing not at the periphery this time, viewed with cautious suspicion, but integrated fully into the assembled group of allied species. When the ceremony called for representative gestures of goodwill between delegations, I made a choice that would have been unthinkable only days before. Rather than remaining strictly within the formal boundaries of my own delegation, I crossed the hall and took a seat directly beside Ethan, in full view of every delegate, every camera, every representative from every world gathered for this historic moment. The reaction rippled through the hall immediately. Murmurs and glances exchanged among delegates, still uncertain how to interpret this deliberate, public gesture. But this time, no guards rushed forward in alarm. No one moved to pull me away. My mother, standing at the head of our delegation, met my eyes across the hall and offered the smallest, most genuine nod I had ever received from her, a silent acknowledgement that the world she had spent her entire reign protecting me within had finally begun to shift towards something new. "You're causing another incident," Ethan murmured beside me, though his voice carried warmth rather than concern this time. "I'm causing a good one," I said. "There's a difference." He smiled at that, genuine and unguarded, nothing like the careful precision I had witnessed during the attack, nothing like the tired weariness from our very first conversation, just quiet warmth between two people who had crossed an impossible distance to understand each other honestly. Looking back now, I understand that everything meaningful about this summit began with a single reckless choice, a young princess ignoring every warning she had ever received and sitting beside a stranger she had been taught her entire life to fear. I could not have known then how far that single choice would carry us, through suspicion and doubt, through danger and revelation, all the way to this moment, sitting openly beside a human in front of the entire assembled galaxy, no longer afraid of what that choice might mean. They warned me humanity was the species you feared standing beside. They never told me they might become the ones worth standing beside instead, once someone finally took the time to understand the full weight of their history, rather than simply the fear it had left behind. And as the ceremony continued around us, delegates from a dozen worlds witnessing an alliance take its first genuine steps forward, I found myself grateful, more than anything else, that I had chosen curiosity over caution on that very first day, and had never once looked back.